Great. Well, welcome to the first session of today after our opening remarks. Third day. I hope everyone's powering through. And if you're tired, there's nothing like the topic of flood insurance. It's going to wake you right up. So today we're going to talk about flood insurance and its role in recovery. I'm here sharing the stage with a great panel of folks. I'll introduce myself first and then let them introduce themselves next. My name is Christine Meisner. I work in the Office of Disaster Recovery in the Policy Division. I'm actually a newer staff member. I just joined the team in February, but I'm not new to HUD. I come from the Chicago field office working in the entitlement program. And before that, I worked for FEMA in the mitigation division. So I'm really happy to be here today and I'll pass it down.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Shaw-Soggle. I am a program environmental clearance officer for disaster recovery, nested in the Office of Environment and Energy at HUD. I've been in this role for the past 2 years, but I've been with HUD for about 13, 14 years as an engineer in the Office of Public and Indian Housing.
Good morning, everyone. I am Lindsay Wallace. I'm the Senior Advisor for the Federal Insurance Directorate at FEMA. I've been with FEMA for about 8 years, working various programs in resilience, specifically the mitigation insurance portfolio. But prior to coming to FEMA, I was actually at HUD in the Office of Sustainable Communities. And then prior to HUD, I worked for the State of Wisconsin Emergency Management Office. And then even prior to that, I worked for the City of DeKalb, Illinois, managing their entitlement program for CDBG and then the Continuum of Care program. So I've kind of, like Christine, floated in and out of the program space for about 20 years.
Awesome. Okay, so let's kind of get into the content here. We have a little less than an hour. We want to make sure we get everything covered and have some time for questions. So our learning objectives today is we're really hoping after this session that you'll have a much better understanding of what the National Flood Insurance Program is and how it helps property owners recover from flood disasters and kind of help to reduce that socioeconomic impact of floods. We also hope you walk away with a better understanding of HUD's flood insurance regulations and kind of how the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973 and Section 582 of the National Flood Insurance Inform Act impact CDBG-DR funding and projects that you might have in the floodplain. And of course, we want you to also walk away with an understanding of the computer matching agreement that we have between our two agencies, between HUD and FEMA, and how you can access National Flood Insurance Program data for documentation purposes, program design, eligibility determinations, and such. So our agenda pretty much matches what I just went over in terms of learning objectives. Lindsay's going to talk to us about the National Flood Insurance Program. Moving forward, probably refer to that as the NFIP, so that's the same. Brian's also going to discuss the flood insurance regulations as it pertains to CDBG-DR, HUD's flood insurance regulations. And then Lindsay and I are going to talk about that computer matching agreement, what some of the data contains and how you can access the information. And with respect to the theme of the conference for reducing the administrative burden, you're going to sort of see some icons on the screen. So we have the folder and you'll see that later in the presentation that indicates where we're sharing a tool or a resource that's going to help with documentation. So for example, Brian will talk a little bit about the FEMA Map Service Center, and that's a tool that you would use to download a map to show where your project area is and if it's in a floodplain. And that'll just kind of help with your environmental review record and your project files for if HUD were to ever come and monitor your construction or rehab project. And then the second connection point to the theme of the conference is we're sharing a standardized process. So for this presentation, that's the computer matching agreement. And that's a process that's going to help you more quickly access NFIP data to inform your recovery projects. Okay, so I'm going to pass that to Lindsay. There's the clicker.
Great, thank you. And so I kind of gave you a little bit of background about me already, but I love the National Flood Insurance Program very much. Like, I've worked in all of the aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program from the local, state, and federal perspective, and it is a very unique program. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But my first question for you all is, about how many of your communities have experienced flooding but not received a presidentially declared disaster? Could I see a show of hands? It should be everyone. So the one thing that is pretty great about the National Flood Insurance Program is in order to access the claims process, you do not need a presidentially declared disaster. And so I think that is the one thing that folks need to keep in mind when we're talking about this program is, yes, we do come in post-disaster in a presidentially declared event. However, we pay all of the time, even when there's not a declaration. And so that is something that I think people forget. And that's the one thing that we've been trying to reiterate. The other part of the NFIP, and we'll get more into this, but you're seeing the chaos happening within the insurance industry right now. Carriers leaving states, dropping policyholders, covering only certain perils. The National Flood Insurance Program will not leave the state. So one of the questions that came up post-Ian was, well, what happens, when the NFIP can't pay? The NFIP will pay. It is federally backed. We will pay our claims. You don't have to worry about like other insurance companies leaving and saying, we're done, we can't pay it here. The NFIP will pay. And so I think there is some peace of mind when having an NFIP policy. But a couple things that we'll get into a little more, and I just want to set this stage. We'll talk a little bit more about flooding in America. I don't need to preach to you all, more than most, the impacts of flooding from pluvial flooding to fluvial flooding all across the board. We'll talk a little bit about the NFIP's history and mission though, and that's where I get really excited because there is more to the NFIP than just flood insurance, which most people do not know. Then we'll get into flood insurance, but again, that's because I work for the Federal Insurance Directorate. So you're going to hear a little more about the policy pieces of that. And then we'll finish with some conclusions and takeaways. So a couple things. When we talk about the NFIP, we first kind of have to pull back and talk about flooding overall. Flooding is America's #1 natural disaster. History's taught us that just about 1 inch of water can cause about $25,000 worth of damage to a home. And it's interesting because the conversation shifted a little bit. Usually we talk flooding with, riverine flooding, whether it's North Dakota, and yes, I'm from Wisconsin, so I can't say Dakota without slowing down with my O's. Whether we're talking about the Red River in North Dakota, any flooding on the Mississippi, and then again, coastal flooding, that is something that we consistently hear, but we're starting to see floods and those really intense rains, whether they're from atmospheric rivers, whether Texas flooding the past week, these really intense rain events where the rain just keeps coming and coming and coming, and it's affecting the entire country. And so what we've, delineated, whether it's riverine flooding or coastal flooding, is having a little bit of a change. And we'll talk a little bit about the NFIP mapping program, but I think that if you can, one of your takeaways for this session today is where it can rain, it can flood. And I think that is becoming more and more apparent. Every single day we turn on the Weather Channel and we're seeing what's happening across this country. And again, too, and I talked about this, one of the things about, many flood disasters is that they're not presidentially declared. And so disaster benefits are limited. And I won't even get into supplementals right now, but I mean, that's the truth of it. We end up having a lot of damage happening in the US from flood related losses that are not being covered because the way that we've designed programs, for better or for worse, are not being activated. So we have a lot of disaster suffering from flood occurring in the nation. And what's interesting too is that, again, I don't need to preach to you about the caveats of flooding and that type of thing, but most homeowners and other folks in the community and general public do not understand the issues that we're talking about here. They don't understand the program. So when we're talking about reducing administrative burden or otherwise, we within the National Flood Insurance Program, and especially the Federal Insurance Directorate, have really taken a lot of steps to reduce those burdens on the policyholders, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then the last note I'll make on this is that we all saw the headlines after Hurricane Ian about the lack of flood insurance policies among those hardest hit by the storm. For too many individuals do not have flood insurance, and very few realize that homeowners insurance do not cover flood damage. I had my cousin, again, this is very Wisconsin of me, but my cousin's friend's daughter in Florida, I got a call one day shortly after Ian. My husband also works for FEMA, so he was deployed with Urban Search and Rescue. And so she called me and she's like, Lindsay, can you please talk to Angie? Angie's daughter's down in Florida. They bought a house, but they don't know how to apply for FEMA assistance. And I said, okay, I will talk. So I called her and I went through everything. She's like, yeah, she's 23. She just bought this house with her husband and she's trying to figure out how to register for FEMA. And I said, I'm going to stop you right there. Give me all of her insurance documents. I want to see if she bought an insurance policy before we start trying to head down the FEMA individual assistance process. And she's like, okay, but I don't think she did. So she gets me, and sure enough, they have a $170,000 policy written through Right Flood for this. And I said, you guys, you're okay. We're going to start the claims process right away for you. We don't have to worry about going through 1-800-621 FEMA or otherwise. We're going to have you call your insurance company right now and notify of first loss. And she's like, oh, this is great. They didn't even know they bought this. And I said, oh my gosh, that's crazy to me. But again, like, she's 23. I guess I probably didn't think about that either until I started working for Wisconsin Emergency Management at 26. So there's just this lack of understanding about what is there and what is available and what the benefits of the program are. Oops, it easy. Wrong one. All right. So this map is highlighting the projected rise of flood losses across the U.S. from 2020 to 2050. The darkest blue, which is nearly all of the East Coast and the Southeast over to Texas, much to the far west, are projected to have 20% or more of flood losses by 2050. So again, we're talking about this increased loss that is happening from climate change, explosive growth in these areas and development, and then just general denial of flood risk. And I think that is the one thing that always just really blows my mind. I have homeowners insurance that includes fire coverage, right? I have never used it, knock on wood. I've just jinxed myself. But again, I'm going to pay for it because I know I need it, because I don't know, I can't afford those losses to my home if if God forbid something happens. And I don't know why there has been this differential between flood loss and homeowners, right? Like fire is built into homeowners in most instances. And so, we talk about this over and over again, and people are like, well, it's not going to flood by me. And I'm like, well, you may have a lower risk of flood, but you can't say that it's not going to flood. And so we'll get into this a little more, but that has just been a little bit of the mindset that we kind of get into when we talk about general denial of flood risk. And the other part to this is that this is a problem that is shared by everyone. It's shared by governments at all levels, local, states, tribes, territories, federal government, everyone. And it's shared by the private sector as well. And we have, the general public also, is really taking it as well, because a lot of the disaster funding that goes out the door, whether it's through FEMA or otherwise, those are all coming from the federal budget. And so in the end, this is a problem that needs to be addressed by all aspects of the community. So setting the stage for flood, we're going to turn a little bit and talk about the NFIP history and mission. And this is where I get excited because I'm not going to just talk about flood insurance here. I'm going to talk about all of the aspects of the flood insurance program. There is a video that I'm not going to show today, but if you're ever interested, it's only about 8 minutes. And it's by the National Hazard Center in Boulder, Colorado. And it is a video about the father of floodplain management, Gilbert White. And Gilbert, and I'll talk a little more about him in a bit, but if you get a chance to watch this video, the thing, I cite it often, but the one thing he talks about the National Flood Insurance is that it was, the National Flood Insurance Program is that it was never designed to be an insurance program. It was actually designed to be a land use program that sells flood insurance. It was a land use program first and foremost, with the opportunity if folks, adopted those floodplain ordinances at the local level, that they would allow and encourage their communities to, and homeowners to buy flood insurance. And so I think that is the one thing that I want to keep in mind, is that it's kind of flipped on its head a little bit. And we have this conversation often when we're talking about flood rates, like premium costs or otherwise. We aren't necessarily focusing as a nation, I'm not going to say the program, but as a nation, on what we can do to reduce risk. Oftentimes we're hearing about what we can do to reduce premium, but not to actually reduce the flood risk. And that is where that floodplain ordinance piece, the floodplain management piece of the National Flood Insurance Program was critical to it being successful. So in 1968, the National Flood Insurance Program was created by Congress to do a couple things. One, mitigate future flood losses. Two, enact and enforce those floodplain management regulations. And three, again, third, to offer federally backed insurance policies. And so those are the three big goals of the program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how flooding has kind of evolved in the US. We initially started around the Civil War era of thinking we could control water through levees or other structural means. And that was the primary policy of the United States at that point in time. And by 1913, 1927, we saw some very significant flood losses on the Ohio River Valley, as well as the Great Mississippi River of 1927, that were killing thousands of people. Thousands of people were homeless. Millions of dollars were lost. And you started to see American insurers pull back. And after that flood in 1927 is where they started to think, okay, flood is not a peril that we can be part of. And at that point in time in 1927, the US started to rethink that levee-only policy, that structural mitigation-only policy. And so in the 1930s and 40s, you started to see that call for a mixed use of structural, non-structural mitigation measures led by Gilbert White, the father of floodplain management. And one thing that he pushed for an American policy that was looking for us to live with water and not control it. And that was really what the basis of his research and findings. About 1951, we started to see more conversations, especially after massive flooding in Kansas, in Missouri, leading to try to take further action on this. But I'm going to start this. 1951, they started to get really serious about that concept of more holistic floodplain management. And by 1963, Hurricane Betsy came and hit the US. And that was only when they got really serious about thinking about taking measures to figure out and talk through floodplain management and flood insurance in the United States. And then 5 years later, they actually enacted the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. So it had been nearly a 40-year push to think through floodplain management and the appropriate solution. And so today, right now, the National Flood Insurance Program provides flood insurance policies, flood mitigation grants, flood risk information through mapping, and floodplain management education and resources for more than 22,600 communities. And I think that one of the things that for me, the National Flood Insurance Program has been really focusing on is one, reducing disaster suffering from floods, but the second part of that's the education. And for me, the education is even greater, the greater need right now when we're talking about, I want to get the 1% annual chance flood, which to me was one of the most frustrating coining of phrases in the federal government that makes no sense to anyone, and trying to get out of that. And the 1 in 100 year flood is just even worse. And it doesn't make sense. And we have a communications issue when we talk about flooding in the United States. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to shift that. But again, that education part of this is so important. This graphic I am looking to change. For decades, it has been referred to as the four-legged stool, the National Flood Insurance Program being a four-legged stool. It just drives me nuts. I don't know why, but I'm thinking I have something better with a puzzle piece, and it'll, if you see it next time I'm around, I'll hopefully have it changed. But one of the things that the National Flood Insurance Program does do, and we talked about this, it has the mapping program. So it has the floodplain management piece of this. It has the flood mitigation risk piece, or the flood mitigation grants piece, and then the insurance piece. And so again, it is not a successful program if one of these pieces are missing. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't know about the NFIP is it's more than an insurance company. We are offering floodplain management technical assistance nationwide. We're mapping nationwide. And again, we'll get into the maps for better or for worse, but there is just so many more parts of this. And we have the mitigation grants component of this. How many of you have heard of the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program? Okay. How many of you have heard of FMA Swift Current? This is a newer program. Those are all funded by the National Flood Insurance Program. We take that out of policyholder premium. And that is how dedicated we are into trying to reduce the flood loss, not only for our policyholders, but for the US. So I mentioned that the National Flood Insurance Program is unique for one reason. One, it's more than flood insurance. It's this four-legged stool. But it is also unique because it's a public-private partnership. We would not be successful, or we could not run a program without the Write Your Own companies that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program with us. While FEMA does, the flood risk identification, the insurance, in the end, we would not be able to sell the insurance without our WIO partners. And we have about 50 right now from just across the board, flood insurance companies, Liberty Mutual, Nationwide, Allstate, USAA, Wright Flood, a bunch of smaller carriers. And so they sell our product for us. And so we work very closely with them. But again, the National Flood Insurance Program cannot do its job without the locals enforcing the floodplain management ordinances. We cannot do it without the states working through the National Flood Insurance Program coordinators within your states. We could not do it without the communities and the individuals themselves. And so this is truly one of those programs that requires all hands on deck. So another fun statistic is that the National Flood Insurance Program is actually the largest single peril insurer in the world. in the world. Right now, we have about 4.7 million policies. Most of it's residential. We have about 95% of our book is written for residential. Only about 5% is written commercial. The other, and that is not to say commercial is not covered, non-residential is not covered, but they're usually picked up by the private sector. And I think one of the other important parts of this is that the NFIP is one of those programs that goes directly to and works directly with the local governments. 22,625 are currently participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. I had a conversation with Jen Carpenter early on, and she had mentioned that there were some questions about coverage or who was able to purchase and whether some communities were available. If you ever have questions about whether your community is participating, let me know. We can talk about that after this. But I think, when we talk about the overall program, it is meant to be this comprehensive approach to flood management. I'm going to talk a little bit about flood insurance now, just because of where I come from. But again, we'll have some questions and answers afterwards if you have any further questions on the mapping and grants and floodplain management side. And this is, I think, really important too. Even the best mitigation programs cannot alleviate all flood damage, particularly with the increasing nature we find ourselves with severe flooding and climate change. And I think that is something that we've been talking about often within the National Flood Insurance Program is we may not be able to mitigate out of flood insurance premiums 100%, which means like we may not be able to reduce all damages through mitigation, but we certainly can try. And the one thing that can step in to help cover those damages that still will happen, even with the best forms of mitigation, is flood insurance. And it'll provide, policyholders with financial help to protect the lives that they've built. So what is flood insurance? Flood insurance is a type of property insurance that covers dwelling for losses from sustained water damage, specifically due to flooding. Standard homeowners insurance covers interior water damage like broken pipes, but it does not cover flood loss. Flood insurance policies are available for nearly all residential and commercial properties, so long as they are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. Like I said before, 22,625 communities are participating. If a community is not participating in the NFIP, they cannot buy National Flood Insurance Program insurance coverage. That does not preclude them from going outside the private to look at the private sector. So they still can buy flood insurance. It just would have to be through a private carrier. But again, anyone who, again, if you take nothing away from this talk today, anyone who lives in a participating community can buy flood insurance. How many of you have heard, and we'll get into the myths slide in a little bit, but just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard, hey, you've heard from someone say, hey, I can't buy flood insurance because I'm not allowed? I will tell you, I heard it going on preliminary damage assessments, even in the state of Wisconsin. I would hear it from about every fourth house, whether my insurance agent said, I can't buy it or I don't need it. False. I mean, I'm literally walking through your house with flood damage right now. So clearly you would have needed that, or you could have bought it. And that is one of my biggest pet peeves. Even I had a conversation yesterday with someone, a colleague, and they're like, yeah, we talked with someone who was interested in the NFIP, and they said an insurance agent told them they couldn't buy it. That is just flat out wrong. If you are a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program, and by all odds, there's a good chance you are if you're part of the 22,625 communities, you can buy flood insurance. Your policy, your residents can buy flood insurance. And that doesn't mean just property owners. We also offer renters insurance as well. So I lived in New Orleans for about 5 years. You better believe I had residential flood renters flood insurance for my contents. And that is certainly one of the things that is available to folks. One of the other notes of this is that while we do have separate coverage for both structure and contents, that's currently how our policy forms are written. We're currently going through the notice of proposed rulemaking process to streamline our form to make it more like every other insurance company's forms. So when you go to your insurance agent, they're not fumbling and trying to figure out how to do the flood insurance form versus the normal property and casualty insurance form. And so until May 31st, feel free to go visit the Federal Register and take a look at the flood forms. And if you have any comments on that, please submit that. Again, as we look to reduce administrative burden for our agents, for our policy holders, this is one of those efforts that we're looking to do to streamline how they apply for flood insurance, and then also some of the options. So right now we do not offer basement coverage. Coming from Wisconsin, that's crazy to me because I don't know how much time we spent in our basements, whether it was from tornadoes or just from general time there in expanding your living space. And so the fact that the NFIP has not offered flood insurance for basements was very surprising to me. So again, that is also part of the flood insurance, the standard flood insurance policy form that we're looking to upgrade. So if you have any comments on that, good or bad, please submit those. And again, that's open through May 31st. So I've already harped on this, who can buy flood insurance? Pretty much anyone, as long as you live in those participating communities. One of the notes about mandatory purchase requirement is if you do have a federally backed mortgage, you are required, and if you have a federally backed mortgage and you live in the special flood hazard area, you are required by your lender to purchase it. And again, you can either purchase through the National Flood Insurance Program or the private sector. We don't care. We just want people covered with flood insurance. And that is, I think, really important to note. Talking a little bit about those flood maps that I had mentioned earlier, the flood maps simply delineate. How many of you have seen a flood map before? Yeah. There's a line on it. You're either in the floodplain or you're out of the floodplain, out of the 100-year or the special flood hazard area. And it's just been this like yes or no, this binary approach. FEMA is thinking through that process. Right now, those maps are meant for regulatory purchases on the mandatory purchase requirement. However, FEMA is moving towards this thing called the future of flood risk data that is looking to show graduated flood risk to more accurately depict flood risk for communities, opposed to just a line on a map saying yes or no. And that is kind of what our new rating methodology for the flood insurance program shows through rates. There's this graduated risk. Now the mapping piece of this is starting to catch up as well. And so they are working through a pilot, but expect to see more from the National Flood Insurance Program on mapping and how we can help local governments think through how to accurately depict to their residents the flood risks within the communities. And so we're thinking more about perhaps a data service type of approach, opposed to giving you maps. You'll be able to think through what data you want to turn on, what you want to turn off, to how to visually depict that. But again, this is all in pilot and concept right now, but this is where we're moving towards, because again, that education piece of flood risk is so critical. Now talking and turning a little bit to how to buy flood insurance. We can do it through insurance agents, which is, again, you call your carrier, see if they offer it. If they do not offer it, which some don't, like my in-laws just bought a new house. Interestingly enough, he PC, their homeowners insurance said, hey, we're not going to actually sell you your homeowners. We'll give you your flood insurance. We'll let you buy your flood insurance, but you're going to have to go through somewhere else because we are not going to insure any home within 2 miles of the coast. And they're in New Jersey. And I was like, so she calls me in a panic because they're about to go to closing. And I said, that's fascinating. And again, the market's starting to adjust for what they're willing to take on in terms of risk. And so they were able to find another lender for homeowners. I'm sorry, another insurer for homeowners about 2 hours before closing. But that's starting to be what you see. This insurance company was more than willing to sell flood insurance because that was backed by the federal government, but they themselves weren't willing to take on the risks for their own company. And so that is starting, if that isn't a wake-up call, I had told my my principal that, and he was like, here we are. This is where we started to see some of those market interventions coming in. But again, I kind of digressed a little bit, but how to buy flood insurance through insurance agents, through your write your own programs. And you can go to floodsmart.gov to find those participating write your own companies, or the NFIP Direct. And the NFIP Direct is a vendor that we work with that actually sells on behalf of FEMA. And so when insurance agents, independent insurance agents not tied to one of the WIOs, they can go through the NFIP Direct to write flood insurance policies for us. One note is that there's a 30-day waiting period between submitting the policy application and the effective date. And so that's to prevent, like, if you see a hurricane coming and someone wants to get insurance right away and then drop it after the the storm has passed, we're trying to avoid some of that. Where you do see that waiting time eliminated a little bit is the flood after fire. So we do, and we work typically with our FEMA regions to do flood after fire campaigns that helps reduce that wait time by 15 days, especially for those areas that have experienced wildfires. Really briefly, I'll get into group flood insurance policies. So if folks receive the individual assistance grant through FEMA, there is this opportunity to receive a group flood insurance policy. It's typically a 3-year policy, 36 months. And we end up covering through flood insurance and through this group flood insurance policy, that property for 3 years to satisfy the obtain maintain requirement that we'll talk about in a little bit. But again, this is through the individual assistance program. So if someone has not been covered by flood insurance in the past that receives an individual assistance grant, they are eligible for this group flood insurance policy. And so I just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of that and that that is available. And again, if you have other questions on that, I can elaborate on that later on. And again, I just wanted to delineate a little bit between the flood insurance and disaster assistance. NFIP covers your contents, your home, if that's the policy coverage you so choose. It is not a loan. Folks do not have to pay it back. It's mostly sold by private insurance agents and companies, but administered by FEMA. And I think that, again, the most important part of this slide is that it pays regardless of presidentially declared disasters. Whereas FEMA or SBA assistance, one, it requires a presidentially declared declaration, disaster declaration. It takes the form of an interest-bearing loan that sometimes has to be paid back, especially when talking about SBA. And the coverage is much lower. Any payouts or any grants received just start to make a dent in actual flood losses. And so again, the NFIP, I think after Harvey, some of the, I know we have the Ian averages on there, but after Harvey, the payout for flood insurance was about $110,000. And max grants for Harvey were about $28,000. So it was a great difference in the recovery abilities of disaster survivors. All right, this is my favorite slide. And I talked a little bit about, you know, who can buy flood insurance, and that is one of the major misconceptions is pretty much everyone, so long as you're participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, your community is. Another myth is, you know, and we talked about this, people don't recognize that homeowners or renters insurance, the typical homeowners policy does not cover flood. And so that is one that we're working hard to dispel, that they need to get a separate flood insurance policy. The second one, and we just talked about this, if my property is hit by a flood, disaster assistance will bail me out. That is not true. And even with the changing allocations for individual assistance every year, most people do not receive max grants, and it doesn't even begin to touch the actual loss on a property. My area is never flooded, so I've got history on my side. That's also false. And we've, again, started to see this over the last couple of years, is that homes that have never been flooded in the past due to intense rainfall or otherwise are starting to be flooded. And so again, where it rains, where it can rain, it can flood. And again, this last one is the nomenclature surrounding a 100-year flood. Well, my home flooded last year, so I'm good for 100 years. Absolutely not. Just the probability. Again, we need to think of ways to work through the communications and changing this and getting folks out of that mindset. So again, where it rains, it floods. Flooding can happen anywhere to anyone. Number two, that the NFIP is unique for two reasons. One, it's more than an insurance company. It protects Americans from flood damage. But then two, it's a public-private partnership that's so important. And that it's incumbent on all of us to be really flood smart and to help our communities think through flood risk, especially those folks that do not know or are aware of their risk. Now, the last part of this, of my remarks here is going to be a video that we worked with these policyholders to talk a little bit about their flood, the NFIP experience. And so if they could cue the video, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. And if it's some technical difficulties, we can always come back to this too. So. All right, okay, 1 minute. Sorry.
Okay, you know, for the interest of time, we're going to skip the video. If we have a couple minutes, if there's no Q&A, we can return to that. Or Lindsay can let us know where we might be able to find that.
Okay.
But if you guys can actually just go back to the slide deck, we'll go to the next section.
So the last part of this resource page is just looking at all the different ways to get in contact with us. And if you have any questions, I'll give you my email after the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer and work through any problems that y'all have.
And for our TA staff, I think we have a different slide that's on our screen versus, oh, perfect. Thank you. Hey, great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm going to speed through some of this so that way we have enough time for the computer matching agreement, which is of great interest. So for those that attended Tuesday's session where we discussed the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, or FFRMS, you know that FFRMS final rule was published just a couple weeks ago. So this has really kind of changed how HUD perceives the floodplain and changes from the 100-year floodplain to this more expansive FFRMS floodplain that both increases in the vertical extent and also horizontal extent. And through that change, we have updated our Part 55 regulations where flood insurance is contained. It's important to note that flood insurance is relatively the same through these Part 55 updates. However, there is additional clarity for flood insurance. So one of the big things that you might be asking yourself is, with that increased floodplain for the FFRMS floodplain, is that changing the area that requires flood insurance for HUD programs? And the answer is no. It's still looking at that 100-year floodplain, or also referred to as the special flood insurance area, which I think is Lindsay's favorite term, versus the 100-year floodplain. So to go through that process, it is up to the responsible entity to review and take a FEMA flood insurance rate map, identify where your property is located on that map to determine if you are in the special flood hazard area or not. And if you are, that property then requires flood insurance. So once again, to be clear, the FFRMS change to Part 55 only requires flood insurance for the special flood hazard area or the 100-year floodplain that's referred to. However, recognizing the potential risks that Lindsay talked about for flooding, HUD certainly encourages any recipient or property owner located in this FFRMS floodplain to certainly take a look at flood insurance, and we encourage the pursuit of flood insurance. In addition, one of the additional clarities in the Part 55 update is that HUD or the REE may require flood insurance beyond the minimus established in the Flood Disaster Protection Act when necessary to minimize financial risk. Typically, this is going to occur when there's additional local ordinances for higher requirements for flood insurance. So how much flood insurance do you need according to HUD regulation? So that is also identified in Part 55.5, and it is the lesser of three different options, which include at least equal to the project cost or less or minus the estimated land cost. So pretty much what the structure costs, because ultimately, if you're able to get additional funds, you can rebuild on the land, hopefully in a more resilient, elevated way. Also, the second option to take a look at is outstanding principal balance of any HUD assisted or HUD insured loan. So that way, if you have damages to that property, you aren't continuing to pay mortgage on that property that you no longer have because it has been damaged. The third option is the maximum limit of coverage available under the NFIP. In addition, our Part 55 regulation incorporates two different laws, the first of which is the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, and this ultimately has a prohibition for providing assistance for projects in the special flood hazard area for communities identified by FEMA for the NFIP but are not participating in that program. And on the slide, you will see a link to the NFIP community status book. And ultimately, this outlines those communities, which I believe Lindsay said there was over 22,000 of those communities. So pretty substantial across the country. But when in doubt, this is a good reference to take a look at. So you can also identify those communities that do not or that are not participating in the NFIP and those that have a suspended or sanctioned community. The other law that's incorporated into the Part 55 update is the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 1994. And this indicates that HUD disaster assistance made available in the special flood hazard area may not be used to make a payment to a person for repair, replacement, or restoration of damage to any personal, residential, or commercial property if that person previously received federal flood disaster assistance and was conditioned on obtaining and maintaining flood insurance, and then they failed to maintain that flood insurance. So the school of thought here is that this property has been identified and subject to flooding in the past, and we want to ensure that there is insurance to help assist for future events. So a lot of this information in our regulation is also found in the Appendix B CDBG-DR Consolidated Notice, specifically Section 4E1 includes that flood insurance purchase requirement that really echoes that if you are in the special flood hazard area, then you are required to obtain and maintain that flood insurance, which also goes into Section 4E2A, which has a prohibition on flood disaster assistance for the failure to obtain and maintain that flood insurance. So there needs to be a checks and balances as you're providing assistance to individuals to see if they had previously received any type of disaster assistance and had that additional requirement. There's also another prohibition that's not included in our regulation there, but in the Appendix B, which indicates there's a prohibition of flood disaster assistance for households above 120% of AMI for failure to obtain flood insurance. And then finally, Section 4E2C, the responsibility to inform property owners to obtain and maintain flood insurance. So it's very important as well included in here that for individuals, they need to also notify any new property owners of the flood insurance requirement, so that way it's passed on to that new property owner. Okay, so how do you identify your flood, special flood hazard area? To do that, you'll go to the FEMA Map Service Center. You can simply put in your address of interest and you will obtain a FEMA flood insurance rate map. And this is where Lindsay kind of indicated that you're looking at the property, seeing if you are in or if you are out of the special flood hazard area. Sounds like that's going to be changing possibly in the near future. But for the time purposes, this is where you'll be referring to see if you are required to have flood insurance. Also, another useful resource along with that FEMA firm is the flood insurance study. So this is a good opportunity to get a cross-sectional of the water or body of water to determine what your 100-year floodplain is, what your 500-year floodplain and the elevation associated with it. So that way you can take a look at the elevation of your property, which can ultimately help reduce your flood insurance rate. And I think at that point, I can switch it over to the computer matching agreement.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. I just want to share a couple last thoughts about our computer matching agreement as it relates to the National Flood Insurance Program and data sets. Going to go through this really quickly. A lot of folks in the room probably already have a computer matching agreement. We just updated this process and template. So if you're in your current agreement, you can stay in your current agreement. For anyone who's not and is going to enter into a new agreement, this is the agreement you'd be entering into. And it's exciting because you actually get to access NFIP data, where in the past it was traditionally just the FEMA individual assistance, but now you get access to both data sets. If you're just hearing about this today for the first time, that's okay. We have more information forthcoming. There's going to be a grantee training launch and some FAQs that we'll post to HUD.gov, but you can go to HUD.gov today or whenever you'd like to and look at the full agreement and see what the language is in there. But it's a very streamlined process. In the past, I think it took grantees almost like 6 months to get a computer matching agreement in place. And now we have kind of expedited that process. You no longer have to post the agreement on the Federal Register notice. We have a pre-established template that you would just sign on to and agree to use that data in terms of planning and marketing. You might want to access NFIP for the development of your action plan and to determine your unmet needs, look at claims data, maybe see what was eligible, what was ineligible, where there might be a lapse in coverage for property owners. And of course, then you might also want to use it to determine who might have insurance to be in compliance with Section 582 that Brian just talked about. So there's a lot of different ways to use that data. Okay. So yeah, it's a quicker way to access the information. You can also sign on to that agreement using DocuSign, so it's a little bit easier. It's an 18-month agreement, and then it gets extended for 12 months, and you don't actually have to ask for the extension. It just kind of automatically happens if it were to be extended. So it's a way for you guys to get data quicker to then more quickly kind of implement recovery programs. So the purpose of the computer matching agreement, for those who might not know, again, is to access information from FEMA to inform unmet needs, to maybe anticipate to the degree of beneficiaries that you might need to support with CDBG-DR funds, and to also see who might be eligible to receive, be a beneficiary for like a construction or a rehab project and a floodplain, to determine if they are in compliance or out of compliance with Section 582 that Brian talked about. That again, if they had received federal assistance in the past that was conditioned on maintaining that insurance and they didn't, then that would be a data set that you can use to verify that information. So that determination is the first bullet. I'm not going to repeat that. And then in order to make the request, it depends what you're using the data for, but if you're using the NFIP data to develop your action plan and you need it for planning, marketing purposes, you don't have to have a published action plan to make that request because it's for the plan. So you would just kind of go through your grant manager, make the request for the data. And as long as you have your mid areas, your most impacted, distressed areas determined, then you could, potentially access the data for that purpose. If you need to access NFIP data post-plan and you need it for insurance verifications or for program design, then you do need to have your public action plan, and it at least needs to be out for public comment. And that's something that we would validate that you have when you put through the request, the CMA request. I know we're real quick on time, but Lindsay is just going to go over real quick what some of the data that's being shared is through NFIP, and then we'll wrap up our session today.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So a couple things for the data that you're able to access through the CMA. Location information includes agent supplied data, which includes name, address, NFIP community number, and name, which is useful when you're going back to that community status book with the link. Second one is the geocoded location data, including lat, long, and accuracy, as well as insured property in the county. And then third, potential data quality issues are also flagged. So that can be location data may be incomplete, geocoded data may conflict with data supplied by the agent. So again, things that we can help figure out and work through, but those are just some data quality issues you may see. Second part of this is the policy information that you can pull. So you can include policy numbers, and insurance company name, policy effective dates, policy expiration date, which is also really critical. Building information, including occupancy type, whether it's a post-firm property or the building type itself. And then third, the additional FEMA specific information, whether it's a rep loss property or a severe rep loss property, which is really key, especially if you're working through the new FMA Swift Current grant program that helps you think through that. And then finally, when we talk about claims data, we're talking exactly what's here: data loss, building or contents payment, the increased cost of compliance payment, which is a mitigation element located within the policy that helps elevate the property up to $30,000. And then also any FEMA declaration information needed for the grants.
Great. Thank you so much. There's a lot of links and hyperlinks embedded in the slide deck that obviously you have access to. We're highlighting just 3 here. That's the landing page for the NFIP program, which is floodsmart.gov. Lindsay mentioned it. We also have a flood insurance page on the HUD exchange where you can get more information. And then we also have HUD.gov where you can access the existing agreement and kind of see what some of the updates are. So thank you so much for joining us today. If anyone has burning questions, I think we could probably maybe stay, but I know we're also at a break, so no pressure, but you can also come up to us after.